this speech and she will get mad.
Got your name on some documents here, Graham.
We all here and down? Down? Good evening. I'm delighted you're all here. Welcome. I'm Fred Schauer. I'm the academic dean of the Kennedy School, but more importantly and more relevantly for this evening, I am the acting director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. Our purpose here tonight is threefold. The first is to, for those of you unaware of the center and what it does, is to introduce the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. The Carr Center is the creation, inspiration, and vision of partly the school, but more substantially Gregory Carr, whose commitment to the center and commitment to a human rights center at the Kennedy School was based in large part on his own commitment to human rights, but also, and just as importantly, his own commitment as a graduate of the Kennedy School to what the Kennedy School itself could contribute to the study of human rights, the teaching of human rights, and the practice of human rights. That I feel a bit funny saying this because, like a bare majority of the panelists, I am a lawyer. But one of the reasons for having the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the school was the recognition by Greg and by a number of us at the school that human rights, although very importantly about law, very importantly about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was not just a legal issue and not just a legal problem. It is a medical problem. It is a philosophical problem. It is a policy problem, and it is a problem that spans the full range of disciplines that we represent at the school. Whether it be questions of implementation of policy, which policies work and which don't, philosophical questions that are remarkably difficult about tensions between transnational norms and the urges or pulls of multiculturalism, questions of health involving AIDS and medical research and a large number of other health problems. All of these and many more raise human rights issues that the center is devoted to teaching about and studying about. I'm delighted to be the acting director of the center. There will at some time in the hopefully sooner rather than later future be a non-acting director, but it's been a privilege to serve as the acting director since the center's creation. The second reason for being here tonight is to celebrate one of the many tangible products of the center in its short period of existence. This tangible product, is Realizing Human Rights, which Samantha Power and Graham Allison have edited. And again, drawing on what we like to think at the school is our comparative advantage in combining the experiences of practitioners, the insights and self-reflection of practitioners with the best of academic work. This is a book that collects the work not only of a number of our panelists here, but distinguished academics in the human rights area, such as Louis Henkin, and some number, Macau Machua, and some number of others, as well as distinguished practitioners whose names are even more recognizable, such as Kofi Annan, Aryeh Nair, John Shattuck, and Jimmy Carter. By combining the academic and the practitioner experiences, it is exactly what the center is devoted to doing and why the center is located both within the school and within Harvard University. And our final mission for this evening is to address directly the topic of human rights versus human wrongs. How far have we really come? To translate that, it is to address the question central to the center's agenda of evaluating policies, evaluating laws, and evaluating programs in light of what has actually happened, and engaging in the kind of empirical, philosophical, self-reflective research that enables us actually to evaluate policies rather than merely to announce them. To address this topic tonight, we have a quite distinguished panel in the order in which they will speak, and arrayed from closest to me to farthest away from me. Graham Allison is the faculty chair of the Carr Center. Douglas Dillon, Professor of Government at the Kennedy School, Director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Kennedy School. For many years, the Dean of the Kennedy School of Government, instrumental in creating the school in its current size and scope, a distinguished scholar of national security, international relations, and foreign policy. His classic book, Essence of Decision, Explaining the Cuban Missile Crisis, first published in 1971, has just come out in its second edition. Juan Mendez, director of the Center for Civil and Human Rights at the Notre Dame Law School, is one of those very important people in the area of human rights who has not only been a distinguished scholar of human rights, not only a distinguished practitioner of human rights, but importantly, although unfortunately, a victim of human rights abuses. For many years, a political prisoner in his native Argentina, then executive director of the Inter-American Institute for Human Rights, and as I said, now director of the Center for Civil and Human Rights at the Notre Dame Law School, and another lawyer. Samantha Power, still another lawyer, despite the presence of a generous benefactor, an acting director, and a faculty chair. Samantha Power, as executive director of the Carr Center, is the one who is actually responsible for all that the center has done, all that the center now is, on not only a day-to-day basis, but in the large as well as in the small, the most instrumental person in the current degree of success and prominence of the center. Samantha, in addition to being a lawyer, is a distinguished journalist, a frequent author for the New Republic and other publications. She's currently writing a book, The Quiet Americans, to be published by Random House in 2001, which examines U.S. responses to genocide since the Holocaust. Deborah Work-Zoudy is a PhD in immunology. I think at times, unfortunately, the medical and scientific side of the human rights issues are ignored. I'm glad that we can do a little bit towards remedying that. As I said, PhD in immunology from the University of London, for many years active in a number of health and human rights issues, and is now head of the World Bank's new AIDS campaign for Africa called ACT Africa. She's previously worked in a number of other capacities on human rights issues and on AIDS issues in particular. Kwesi Bachwe, director of the Africa program of the Center for International Development, our fourth lawyer here. Kwesi was for 13 years Minister of Finance in Ghana. As Minister of Finance, he was key to the implementation of one of the most far-reaching economic reform programs in sub-Saharan Africa, remains active working on a range of human rights issues in Africa, international development issues in Africa, with a particular focus on both economic and legal development, has worked for a large number of international organizations, including the World Bank, UNDP, the Commonwealth Secretariat, the IMF, and many others. And finally, Michael Ignatieff, with us this year as the Carr Visiting Professor of Human Rights Practice, is a PhD in history from Harvard University, was for some years a fellow of King's College, Cambridge, but perhaps most importantly is what many of us aspire to, but few of us reach, the genuine public intellectual. His series of books of a historical nature on human human rights issues, of international relations issues, reach both an academic and a non-academic audience. His most recent, Virtual War, Kosovo and Beyond, already important, some number of other important books in the past, as diverse as books about human rights, about foreign policy, and the definitive biography of the philosopher Isaiah Berlin. That's the panelists, that's the cast of characters. I'll turn the floor over to Graham Allison. Each of the panelists will talk for 5 minutes, and then we will invite questions, comments, discussion, arguments, whatever the audience finds appropriate. The floor is yours, Graham.
Thank you very much, Fred, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here with such a distinguished panel. We've got 5 minutes to answer the question, as I understand it, human rights versus human wrongs. How far have we really come? And as a latecomer to the human rights community and an outsider, or more outside than I think most of my colleagues, I'm going to offer a very strong proposition, which I want to defend, which is that the human rights community has come further in realizing human rights in the past 50 years, since the UN Declaration of Human Rights, than in any analogous 50 years in the past 1,000 years. So not far enough, but compared to the track record of the last 1,000 years, much further than most people appreciate, and further than at any other comparable period. Basically, this reduces, or I'm going to summarize it under 2 headings. The first proposition is that the basic concept of human rights has undergone a transformation since the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, from utopian fantasy of the time to universally acknowledged fact. So that's the first accomplishment of the 50 years. And secondly, that in the actual realization of specific individual human rights, more people have come to enjoy more rights over the past 50 years than at any comparable period in the previous 1,000 years. Now, I understand these are 2 rather extreme and strong arguments. Indeed, in editing this book, my co-author Samantha and I have argued about this a lot, and this is my view. She'll offer her own view, which she doesn't necessarily subscribe to these 2 propositions, but I think little by little the evidence is weighing her down. At least I'm hoping that might be the case. So let me elaborate for my 3 minutes that remain, or 2 minutes, on these 2 points. First, in 1948, the UN issued a declaration called the UN Declaration on Human Rights. That was dismissed by all reasonable, sound people as utopian fantasy. Okay? It was Eleanor Roosevelt's tear. Okay? In fact, today, this is now accepted fact. Indeed, the proposition that all human beings are endowed with specific inalienable rights simply by virtue of their being human is universally acknowledged. So a view that in 1948 was at least as extreme as the view of Peter Singer, the Princeton philosopher today, who holds that animals have the same rights as human beings of the same IQ. So he would argue that a border collie has the same rights not to be tortured as a Down syndrome child of the same level of intelligence, a view that I think most people here would say is extreme or is fantastical or fantastic. That view, 50 years now, or that whole cluster of views, if they're accepted, will be no more amazing than what's happened in the past 50 years. Indeed, the core content of what constitutes human rights is now very substantially agreed. It's what the UN Declaration and the Convention say. There's about 30 of them, and they include right to life, liberty, personal security, freedom from torture, freedom from slavery, equality before the law, a list of rights which nobody argues about now. Okay? That's the content. Second point, over the past 50 years, if you look at the record, there's been a greater improvement in individuals, human beings' realization of specific core human rights than in any period in the 1,000 years. If you take, for example, Freedom House's annual survey on democracies, from 22 democracies in 1950 to 119 today. If you take the single best measure of economic and social rights, you've had an unprecedented economic growth in the past 50 years, world GNP up sixfold, the highest growth rates in this period ever, with life expectancy over the world and in the developing world increasing by 20 years on average, infant mortality falling. Now, I'm telling you the one side of the story because I'm making an extreme argument. There's another side to the story, which is great income disparities and lots of inhumanity to other human beings. But if the record is relative to the past 1,000 years, in this 50 years, in the recognition of the concept and the realization of the specific rights, I think it's to be celebrated.
Thank you. In Latin America, the answer to the question of how far we've got needs a double answer, really. In the first place, we have come a long way from when most of our countries were ruled by military dictatorships. And in 2000, all but one government is originated, at least in elections. But the human rights agenda now is very much linked to the quality of democracy and what is it that we understand by democracy. We have sometimes said that what we have in Latin America is insufficient democracy. And this means that the people that we have chosen to rule our countries don't have a clear sense of their accountability to our electorates, of the appropriate distribution of powers with other branches of the state. And in this sense, we also have streaks of authoritarianism in almost every elected official that we elect. And in the extremes, of course, we can talk about Mr. Fujimori and Mr. Chavez, but even beyond those cases, we do have a tendency of our elected rulers to, in the words of Max Weber, recur to a sultanistic use of the powers, and like Guillermo O'Donnell says, engage in delegative democracy. That is a serious attack on the rule of law, and the rule of law particularly it bothers me that we don't have, for example, very effective judiciaries. In fact, we now invest less on judiciaries than we did before the outbreak of democracy that we're now enjoying, and the independence and impartiality of our courts is very seriously threatened almost everywhere. And it's beyond their independence and impartiality, we have a serious problem with access to justice by vulnerable groups. Women, children, indigenous populations, their ability to seek redress for the wrongs committed against them in court is seriously deficient today in Latin America. We also have a couple of issues that threaten to destroy some of the advantages that we have achieved after long struggles. For example, the problem of citizen security and criminality, and the demagogic response that it elicits from politicians tends to make it impossible to reform our police bodies. Not only impossible to reform them, but to continue their unaccountability and their tendencies to take the law into their hands. This is also a legacy of one unresolved problem, the problem of accountability for the abuses that we inherited from the military dictatorships. Our democracies have generally been less than effective in dealing with these problems, but in tribute to the strength of the human rights movement and of our civil societies, that issue does not go away. It is still there, present in the political agenda of every single country, and we do make some progress little by little. Of course, there are pockets in Latin America where the worst abuses of the type of military dictatorships or of governments with strong and unaccountable military establishments and civil and armed conflict still attain, like in Colombia, for example. And Colombia is one of those places that will probably put Latin America back in the screen of the human rights movement, especially if this infusion of United States military aid will, as many of us fear, just complicate the problem and make it much more difficult to resolve in the near future. Then we have problems of freedom of expression. We have an incredibly vibrant exercise of freedom of expression, and journalists now enjoy more legitimacy and credibility than they ever had in Latin America before, but they still exercise their profession in very difficult circumstances, and the normative framework in which freedom of expression is exercised is very dated, to say the least, and threatening of freedom of expression. So the human rights agenda, what we still have to do, as I said earlier, has a lot to do with the quality of democracy. The quality of democracy has to be interpreted not only on whether elected government occurs periodically and in more or less free and fair elections, but it also has to do with how our system protects and benefits even especially the most vulnerable in our societies. We have to, and we are not doing well by protecting the rights of inmates in prisons, for example, or in other places of detention and institutionalization, to say the least. We're not dealing well with street children. We're not dealing well with violence against women, including domestic violence. And we have a long way to go in solving problems of rural violence that threaten also to continue to exclude and leave out, not only from the economy, but even from the political process, larger and larger masses of our population. I don't mean to be as negative as it sounds. We have made some progress, and we are definitely committed to protecting those progresses that we have made, but hopefully in the question and answer period, I'll be able to expand on those progresses. Thank you.
Thanks, Juan. The enforcement of human rights remains first and foremost the province of states. I think we all know that. States either respect the rights of the citizens living within their borders, or they have the capacity to influence other states and change the way those states behave vis-a-vis their own citizens. There have been tremendous advances in state behavior. When we look at our own country here, we can look even structurally at the bureaucracy. We now have an assistant secretary for democracy, human rights, and labor. We have State Department country reports that require embassy officials to get out into the field and examine human rights abuses in their host countries, what would have been conceived of 30 years ago anyway as an infringement on the internal affairs of states. We have the proliferation of human rights NGOs designed to pressure states. When you look back to 1961 when Amnesty was formed, it had a budget of $19,000 and focused principally on torture victims and political elites, as well it should have indeed. Human Rights Watch today, the province of the victims that it pays heed to and the province of the states and the state policies that it scrutinizes is so much broader. Landmines, international criminal courts, indiscriminate shelling of civilians, domestic violence, child soldiers, and the traditional political elites and the disappeared and the torture victims. There's a huge expansion in the pressure points and in the subjects for attention for these human rights NGOs, and of course the proliferation of local NGOs who are taking their own states to task. Policies that were once utterly unthinkable have become thinkable. and actions by governments. The Pinochet precedent and the NATO intervention in Kosovo come to mind, however controversial. You could not have conceived of these events 2 decades ago. But in a kind of progress narrative that many engage in today, there's always a footnote. And the footnote very often you'll hear is, I call it the genocide footnote. So all of these things are happening. There is this rhetorical prominence. There's this institutional proliferation. There is a greater sense of accountability. But then there's Pol Pot and Rwanda and Bosnia. And so what I thought I would do in answering the question, that's what my work is on, and it is a grisly kind of footnote, I think, to the progress narrative. But I actually think it's more than that. I think it's a testament to the limits of progress and the testament to the bounds around state behavior. Fundamentally, states do have adopted values and do believe, I think in certain instances, Western states, in human rights policies. But where actions incur meaningful risk or costs, often those values stop short. And I think that's a truism, certainly over time. That's where government draws the line. If you can pair values with traditional interests, traditional so-called vital interests, then you can actually get someplace. But the problem with genocide is it actually tends to isolate values alone. It very rarely occurs in places that are in our traditional vital interests. And what I thought I would do is just focus on one case, the U.S. policy response to the genocide in Rwanda, to illustrate a few of what I think are the key challenges ahead in the human rights community and to the human rights movement, real challenges to state enforcement of human rights, which is where really the rubber meets the road. The genocide in Rwanda took place between April and June of 1994. 800,000 people were killed in 100 days. The U.S. did not contemplate sending troops. It was scarred by its recent intervention in Somalia, which had been bloody and costly. The U.S. also didn't support a reinforcement of the UN troop presence on the ground. There were peacekeepers on the ground, 2,500, when the genocide began. Indeed, it supported and lobbied at some length and at some decibel for a UN troop withdrawal, which it secured almost in its entirety. The U.S. refused to jam radio broadcasts that were spewing hate and also broadcasting the names of the victims or the would-be victims of the genocide, and famously refused to use the term genocide in real time. But more interestingly, there was no policy cleft within the U.S. government, and I think this is notable and very rarely commented upon. There was an internalization of the constraints, of the political constraints among the actors who were shaping U.S. policy at the mid-level and even at the senior level. There was not a single cabinet-level meeting in the 100 days which these 800,000 people were killed, and thus some of the opposition, which stemmed principally from the Defense Department, trumped what might have thought would have been the moral concerns or the human rights concerns of the Rwandan victims once there was an awareness of the scale of what was going on. This was enabled by the fact that there was utter silence outside the government bureaucracy. The Congressional Black Caucus was busy with Haiti, doing actually quite an impressive job drawing attention to Haiti, but was silent on Rwanda. The editorial pages that now clamor about U.S. policy in Rwanda were utterly silent at the time about the possibility of an intervention. Human rights groups, no grassroots constituency, operating at an elite level, having meetings with the National Security Advisor, but not getting out into the community and creating any political cost for inaction in real time. What I want to do is just read you, because I think it's really illustrative of how states debate the most extreme abuses and how costs are calculated and where, again, the challenge ahead lies. I want to read you from a recently unclassified or declassified cable from the Defense Department from this time. It was from May the 1st, 3 weeks into the genocide. And there were several issues under debate as to what the U.S. might do, not military intervention, but soft forms of intervention. One was a genocide investigation. This was May 1, 3 weeks into the genocide. The proposal is language that calls for an international investigation of human rights abuses and possible violations of the Genocide Convention. The Office of the Secretary of Defense's response: be careful. The legal advisor at the State Department was worried about this yesterday. A genocide finding could commit the U.S. government to actually, quote, do something. Point 2. Counter-propaganda. Should the U.S. government engage in additional propaganda activities to get a message into Rwanda to counter the radio stations that are urging the killing? No. This is a significant increase in our role. Suggests that we offer equipment to neighbors and urge them to do it. And then finally, actually from a cable 4 days later on the possibility of radio jamming, This is a cable to the Deputy National Security Advisor, Sandy Berger, now the National Security Advisor, from the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy on radio jamming. The response: Commando Solo, an Air National Guard asset, is the only suitable Pentagon jamming platform. It costs approximately $8,500 per flight hour and requires a semi-secure area of operations due to its vulnerability. I believe it would be wiser to use air to assist in the relief effort, particularly in neighboring countries like Tanzania. We could send blankets and plastic sheeting, medical supplies, and food. I mention these not because I know the question is much broader than what the U.S. policy response to the genocide in Rwanda was, but I do think that the actually giving a hint of the bureaucratic language is very important in terms of understanding the extent to which these norms that have proliferated and that have been institutionalized, but the extent to which they have or have not been internalized. I think you see three things, not just in the cable, not just in these cables, but in the broader cable traffic. I got these through the Freedom of Information Act. You should all use it. It's terrific. But not just through the cable traffic, but also, I think, more communally as a sort of all systems failure in the response to the genocide in Rwanda. You see three things, I think. One, all the framing is, of course, in terms of U.S. interests. So we talk a lot about the sort of human rights making its way into the interest paradigm, and it has up to a point. But everything internally within government is framed, quite understandably, in terms of the national interest. And the interests of Rwandans, there's nobody actually speaking to them or to the victims of gross violations of human rights elsewhere. The second is, and I think Graham could probably testify to this, no moral language here at all. I mean, you use moral language and you're deemed emotional, you don't get invited to the next meeting. So human rights activists have actually learned to frame their arguments in interest terms, and that can be very dangerous, again, when you're talking about places where genocide is happening, because in fact these tend to be places that don't trigger some of the vitals. And then finally, and this is, I think, fundamental, for all of the proliferation of NGOs in all of the quarters around the world, the North America-based NGOs have failed, I think, to generate a grassroots constituency for an international human rights policy or an international or an American foreign policy in this particular instance. And you see this here. The political calculus, the reality in Rwanda and in other cases is that the political costs of doing nothing are next to non-existent, while the political risks of getting involved, even along the continuum, you see, we're not talking in terms of U.S. troops, but even soft forms of intervention, the political risks are deemed sizable. And ultimately, you have human beings making decisions, and in an absence of political leadership that believes in, genocide prevention for genocide prevention's sake, these calculations are made, and it's up, I think, to the next generation and the current generation of human rights actors to think about ways to change the calculus of governments so that states do become the enforcers of the right to life as well as other rights. Thank you.
I'm rarely out of my depth, but I find myself among lawyers, and I feel a little bit wary. The HIV/AIDS epidemic, for those of us in public health, is a window which showed the inequality that exists between the North and the South, between those who have and those who haven't. Human rights, the way I look at it differently in the North and very differently in the South. We have come a long way. At the beginning of the epidemic, all you have to do is to be black or to be coming from Africa for the customs officer to refuse to admit you into a country. We have come a long way. But we are also not that far away. Recently, I sat next to a World Health Organization official who has been working in the World Health Organization for about 30 years. And he said to me, you have politicized this epidemic. And I said, how? He said, it's very easy. We have dealt with epidemics by putting people in quarantines. And if we had done that at the beginning of the epidemic, we won't have this problem. When I recovered from my shock, I said, so you have facilities to put 34 million people in quarantine. So this is the context I see HIV/AIDS and the human rights issue. The solidarity between the North and the South is also tremendous. It's the activists and the human rights and the people living with HIV/AIDS in the North who had focused the attention of the world to those people who are living with HIV/AIDS in the South. about the inequity, especially in treatment. So there are some positives and negatives. I would like to take only 2 examples to illustrate the significance of human rights, especially in developing countries where the epidemic is disproportionate. Voluntary counseling and testing. 90% of people living in sub-Saharan Africa today don't know whether they are infected or not. And in those countries, again, the difference between the North and the South, you need a government which is committed to creating an enabling environment for people to express themselves. For a sexually transmitted disease, which requires behavioral change, which in and of itself is very difficult, it becomes even more difficult when the environment and the order of the day is silence and shame and stigma. If people don't know the status of their serostatus, or if people are afraid that if the community knows that they are infected, then there is very little we can do to curb this epidemic. In 1998, most of you know, a South African woman who disclosed her serostatus was clobbered by her neighbors. To my knowledge, I stand corrected, nothing happened to the people who did that to her. So these are the few things that illustrate this epidemic. And then there is a question of treatment. What do you do with these millions of people if you test them and then you don't provide them with the necessary treatment? That's a human rights issue. Another issue which is prominent in developing countries is marginalized populations, and I only want to take commercial sex workers. At least in my work in sub-Saharan Africa, and I have worked in as many countries as I know, I had yet to find a single woman who says, I am a prostitute because I want to be one. It's purely economic, it's survival. They have their children, they have their mothers, some of them have their grandparents who they had to take care of. How do countries deal with this? They would think by criminalizing sex work, they would deal with this epidemic. They go underground, they are inaccessible to prevention and care, and hence the epidemic increases. Prison is another area where people who have ended up in jail for one reason or another don't have the right, either for information or for prevention, for counseling and testing. So these are the discrepancies which the HIV/AIDS epidemic has brought to forward as a window for all of us to see. Even among public health professionals, there is this misconception that if HIV/AIDS is treated just like any other disease, it could be dealt with. The difference between other diseases and HIV/AIDS is there are cures for other diseases. So if you have a quarantine or if you have forced treatment for people, then you can treat them and they'll be back to normal. But with HIV/AIDS, there is nothing one could do. And if people are not allowed to express themselves, if people are afraid about their disclosing their serostatus, then it becomes a big problem. And you can see as you canvass the globe with this epidemic in areas where the governments of countries are reluctant to break the silence, to admit that this is an epidemic which has to be dealt with collectively, then you see a lot of problems of people going underground. In Asia, where in most of the countries it's, the virus is transmitted through injecting drug use, there it is very difficult to reach these people because of the laws and regulations of the countries. In Vietnam, commercial sex work and drug abuse are legislated, hopefully it has been removed now, as evils of society. And they say if we abolish drug users and commercial sex workers, we can eradicate this disease. In that atmosphere, it's very difficult to have prevention care and treatment activities. Finally, this is not an issue which can be left for countries or country governments. This is an issue which requires international solidarity. When that woman died in South Africa, it's not only South Africans, the whole world should have done something so that this will not be repeated again. Unless we do this, we are sitting on a time bomb, which the prevalence of which is moving exponentially, not only in Africa and in Asia, but in other parts of the world.
Well, thank you, Fred. I've never yet learned to say anything serious in 5 minutes, but I'm going to make today a brilliant start, I hope. Africa's post-independence history bristles with such horrendous cases of human rights violation. The most recent ones in Sierra Leone, where there have been such incredible acts of brutality that it is easy to forget in this kind of climate the very long history of very heroic struggle in Africa against oppression and for human rights, a struggle that has a very long pedigree indeed, and a struggle that is still going on. There is a continuing struggle for the consolidation of democracy and independence in many African countries. It's a struggle that has been galvanized lately by the action of numerous unsung non-governmental organizations and civil society organizations. As a result of this continuing struggle, in solidarity, of course, with international democratic forces, there has been a retreat in dictatorship and the onset of the rejuvenation of democracy in many African countries. Many things have begun to happen that I never imagined would happen in my lifetime. I never imagined that South Africa would be free. I didn't believe that even Nigeria would return to democracy. So the yearning for human rights, for independence, for freedom burns just as fiercely in the African bosom as it does in the breast of all human beings. But thanks to this continuing struggle, there is a change in the framework of legal norms in the region, as well as the framework of, I'm talking about both at a national level and also at the regional continental African level. In 1986, a Charter of African Human Rights was promulgated. In 1987, a commission came into operation, and the Assembly of the OU Heads of State in 1990, I think 1991 or 2 or so, approved the protocol setting up the Human Rights Court in Africa, in 98, I'm sorry. So the pattern and the transformation that we talk about is very general indeed, and as I said, applies very much to Africa as well. If there's any kind of hint of cynicism in African development debate about human rights, let me suggest it's not cynicism at all. It is just a concern that the debate about human rights should sufficiently recognize that the concept itself has expanded enormously and has begun to embrace a much wider terrain of concerns, has been transformed from the purely utopian, if you like, to a realizable goal that includes political as well as economic and social rights. So if there's any appearance of a lack of interest or fervor among Africans, if, it is not a lack of favor at all. It is just a concern that this idea of human rights should be understood to embrace the very difficult economic conditions in which the bulk of the African people operate. And this is understandable. Of the region's 600 million people, about 40% are poor, live under $1 a day. About 75% of them live under $2 a day. 250 million of the lot, just close to half of them, have no access to basic drinking water. Another 200 million of them have no access to health. In these circumstances, it is perfectly understandable that the focus of the concern for human rights should be on the dialectical relationship between the political and the economic. It is not cynicism at all about the very great importance of human rights, because after all, it is recognized that it is a very important foundation even for economic development. So, in Africa as well, there's a real need to reinforce these national and regional initiatives. In many African constitutions, you have enshrined human rights provisions, which, alas, are not always respected, but they can only be respected with consistency if the democratic forces within these countries continue their struggle. And in this regard, of course, the democratic forces in these countries need the support and the solidarity of their international allies. And for the international allies to be effective, one, they must operate preferably within a certain kind of multilateral framework of institutions. Secondly, the action of international forces must be principled, by which I mean, the reaction of the international community to violations of human rights should be the same, whether we are talking Kosovo or Sierra Leone or Rwanda or Burundi. It is distressing when one sees such a monumental effort mobilizing international, not just opinion, but the most awesome weaponry in the world to deal with terrible human rights violations in one part of the world, while the world looks on, while hands are being chopped off, lopped off, and genocide of amazing proportions takes place in other parts of the world. So we must be principled, must be consistent. That is the way that this international effort will acquire the moral strength that would enable it to become a deterrent alongside local struggles against oppression. Because after all, in the final analysis, and this is my final point, human rights is at bottom a matter of poverty eradication. For unless the masses of the people are truly empowered, unless they are given some sort of security against the loss of income earning capacity, against the shocks of natural disasters. Those of you who saw Mozambique during the floods would recognize the desperation that the poor face when these natural disasters occur. So I do believe very much that the democratic forces in Africa are capable, have shown that they will weigh their own struggles against oppression. I do believe that within the framework of multilateral institutions and a framework that allows principled behavior on the part of all the developed world, I think that what has begun as an important transformation of what was Ethiopian before but is now real would very much take root in Africa as well.
Well, as the last speaker, I sat there watching everything I want to say said better than I could have said it. And so I wanted to, and the person that in a way I ended up feeling sorry for, though he never needs to be felt sorry for, was Professor Allison, starting with optimism and progress and then watching it steadily whittled away, continent by continent, country by country, case by case. So I wanted, just for the sake of argument, to end on hopefully utopian moment that joins Professor Allison's comments. I wanted to talk, I think, just very briefly about what it means to believe in human rights, what kind of belief this is. It's not a faith, it's not a religion, secular or otherwise. I think of it as a discipline, a very uncomfortable set of disciplines, a set of propositions that you subscribe to that end up forcing you to believe and do things that don't actually correspond to what you want necessarily. It's like the discipline involved in we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal. I mean, when that stuff was written, we know who it was written for. It wasn't written for everybody. But that language slowly forces a society, pushes a society, drives a society towards the recognition of what those words mean. I feel the same thing about human rights since '48. It's a discipline that's forced us towards towards the struggle towards moral consistency. And consistency is connected to the idea of universality in painful ways that we've discovered. You can't be consistent if you lean on weak states and defer to strong ones. You can't be consistent if you pick victims. Pick your own, the ones close, and ignore the ones far away. You can't be a human rights activist and be happy if you think that the victims in Kosovo are somehow more entitled to the help of the world than the victims in Rwanda or Sierra Leone. There's simply no answer normatively to that, to the challenge made by my distinguished friend and colleague. You can't be consistent if you think human rights applies over there, somewhere else. You got to turn the searchlight on yourself, on your own society, on your own practices. It's very painful. Nobody really wants to do it. Nobody wants other people pointing the finger at you, but that's what consistency forces us to, requires us to. And that discipline commits us to a fourth proposition, and that's in some sense the most important one of all. And I think it's the most important change in the normative framework of international relations since the Second World War, is a commitment to deliberative equality among all human beings. That is, human rights is a European invention, a European intuition, crafted at the end of the most catastrophic episode in Europe's history, an episode that disgraced us all, total war, genocide. The European conscience sought to go back into European natural law and find the basis of a moral framework with which to continue. That attempt to reinvent a European natural law for a post-Holocaust world occurred at the same time as decolonization, at the same time as people that we had ruled and dominated and exploited said, you can't talk this stuff to us unless you live it. You've talked to us about rights and self-determination. You must live by this or we will make you die. The ways in which the words that we said out there came back to haunt us is a crucial part of the human rights story. The one thing I feel passionately about 50 years on, and it's in some sense a very painful thing to live, is that human rights commits us to deliberative equality with our fellow human beings. And human rights is successful to the degree that we deliberate together about what these principles mean, and we do so in conditions of equality. I'm talking about a normative commitment to equality. I'm aware, and everything that's been said here, particularly from our colleagues from the South, makes it clear that there are vast, radical inequalities of power, inequalities of access to goods, inequalities in capacities. I'm aware of all that. But the one thing that human rights is saying, if you believe it, is we can't do top-down. We can't talk down. We talk straight across, eyeball to eyeball, soul to soul, heart to heart. This is one of the most difficult disciplines, one of the most painful disciplines, because it raises questions about universality. It raises questions about our right to impose. It raises questions about cultural practices which are strange and different to us as white Europeans. But in conditions of deliberative equality, we can only look straight across, eyeball to eyeball, at our fellow human beings, at our fellow citizens of a planetary world. And that normative ideal is violated every day. It is denied by the way the international power system of the world is organized. But we know in our heart of hearts, in a way we simply did not in 1948, that is how we do the conversation of the world in the year, in this world, in the world we live in now. And that seems to me to be a tremendous discipline, a difficult discipline for everybody. And it means that the challenge for the future is how to create what the philosopher Charles Taylor calls an unforced consensus of value based on deliberative equality in all the populations of the world of what is the basic minimum that must never be done to a human being under any circumstances for any reason. That's where the debate has to go, an unforced consensus on what is intolerable to do from one human being to another. My great teacher said, Judith Sklar said, put cruelty first. That's, it seems to me, where this unforced consensus is going. Put cruelty first. And I do think this is not meant to be an inspirational sermon. It's meant, in fact, to point out what is historically new about the conversation. That it does occur now between people who know, even if they don't practice what they preach, that they must speak to each other as equals. And if that's the ground, I do think an unforced consensus on the minimum standards of what's tolerable is possible. And to that degree, I'm as utopian as Graham Allison. Thank you.
We have time for questions. There are 2 microphones down here. There are 2 microphones up above. 3 simple rules. 1, keep it brief. 2, questions and not statements. And 3, 1 question, please. Someone else's first question is more important than your second. Henry? And also, please, if possible, direct your questions to an individual member of the panel.
That may be hard. Anne-Marie Slaughter, fellow at the Carr Center this year. Part of many of your remarks involve a shift from a lawyer's conception of human rights, and there are 4 lawyers on the panel, of rights against the state, of rights to be free from an abuse of state power, to a conception of human rights that requires working with the state rather than against the state. Healthcare, economic, social, and cultural rights generally cannot be achieved through litigation, through demonstration, through the standard means that lawyers use against the state. So my question, and honestly to anyone who wants to take a crack at it, is how do we think of a legal model of rights, and indeed in the American lexicon, rights means against the state, that allows us to work with the state to establish the minimum of which Michael Ignatieff spoke?
One? And maybe I'll say something.
Well, I think of course, we need to bring in other circles and not only lawyers, but I think the point of the indivisibility of economic, social, and cultural rights and civil and political rights is precisely that what we have failed to do so far is to bring about the conditions in which economic, social, and cultural rights can be justiciable. That is, that can effectively be demanded. There are some interesting exercises of that sort in my part of the world, and I understand in other parts as well. And I think, in fact, that also comes around full circle to the question of quality of democracy, because without inclusion and without material conditions for the exercise of rights, we are not going to be able to claim the universality that we proclaim. On the other hand, it's also true, and the Latin Americans, we have learned this lesson in a very hard way, that civil and political rights are essential even to the question of bringing about economic, social, and cultural rights and conditions of equality. That doing away with one or even trying to give priority to one over the other is the wrong way to go.
let me stick my oar in on this question. About 2 months ago, the Constitutional Court of South Africa recognized as justiciable the right to housing and shelter contained in the South African Constitution. That may be an example of what we could think of as an interesting international experiment at the moment. You properly describe the view that rights are largely negative as an American view. In South Africa, certainly in Eastern Europe, to some extent in the transforming constitutional cultures of South America, there is now actively being considered the possibility that what we would call positive rights in the Isaiah Berlin positive rights, negative rights dichotomy are in fact legally enforceable, are in fact judicially enforceable. I'm not sure what the result of that experiment will be. Reasonable minds can differ empirically, reasonable minds can differ normatively, but one of the things that's going on, even in parts of the world in which human rights issues are slightly less important than in other parts of the world, is a general experiment about the legalization and judicialization of positive rights. Americans reject it. Maybe in 50 years we'll come back and think that and recognize that the American view that positive rights cannot be enforced by courts was wrong. Yeah, Graham?
Yeah, I think, Anne-Marie, this is a deep topic that you know much more about than I do, but I would, at risk of offending the lawyers, say that what seems to me the most impressive about what's happened is that the proposition that individuals, by virtue of simply being human beings, have a set of inalienable rights has been accepted as a truth and is now virtually universally acknowledged as a truth, independent of the legal arrangements either within the state or between states to recognize them. And it's that prior, David asked a very good question, what does it mean to believe in human rights? It's a belief that just because people are people, it doesn't matter whether they're females or males or whether they're Russians or Americans or whether they live in Africa or the US or whether they're rich or poor or whether they're sick, all those things are not interesting. What's interesting is they're just human beings, and if they get across that line, there's certain core rights that they have. And that's something that we generally do believe about everybody who's a person, even if they are a handicapped person or even if they are a low IQ person, or even if they have some particular disadvantages, which we don't generally now accept about a dog. And I think it's quite an amazing idea that people should say this is true of people just by virtue of their being people, and it's not true of animals. And I think David actually suggested the way to go here, that is the notion of cruelty being intolerable. It actually seems to me like it's not a very good idea to have people torture animals either, okay, if you want to take an extreme view. Now, could you imagine over 50 years that coming to be a generally accepted truth, as generally accepted as this? I think you could. So I think it's amazing that 50 years on, as opposed to saying, well, those guys live in a different country, or those people belong to a different religion, or they belong to a different ethnic group, to say, nope, I mean, if they're people, and people have certain inalienable rights that whatever you think about them otherwise, you believe they have.
Kwesi, very briefly, and then
Well, very briefly, let me give you a lawyer's answer to the question you pose. I think that when we fight for human rights, we are fighting in partnership with the state against agents of the state that are abusing state power. So I don't really see a contradiction as such. I think it is really in partnership.
yes.
Yeah, my name is Ken Choi. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School, and I'm a journalist from Korea. My question is regarding to the policy instruments, since we're all in a policy school. How feasible is it to put economic pressures on these Western or companies that do business with these oppressors? My question stems from the fact that about 10 years ago, a Swedish company inadvertently sent faxes detailing prison systems and torture systems, all these things, to South Korean embassy. In fact, that was directed to North Korean embassy, and it just blew up big time because the Swedish company was selling these, prison high-tech, inescapable concentration camp-style equipments to North Korea. And when there was a big protest, Swedish company simply looked the other way, and it didn't catch any international things. So my question is, like, how feasible is it to forbid, for example, South Korean tear gas companies selling tear gas to Indonesian police, or forbid Israeli gun companies selling bullet guns to other countries, or, forbidding these knife companies selling, knife to Rwandans and so on, to prevent this thing actually from happening?
The issue of human rights against corporations, others in the so-called private sector. Samantha, you want to?
Well, I mean, I think you raise a couple issues. One is sort of an empirical question. Does it work? One of the problems with embargoes, as most people know, of any kind, is that the worst kind of people tend to profit from the embargoes and end up making a fortune. Having said that, in a time of crisis, it can be a short-term sort of mechanism. I'm thinking of arms embargoes more than tear gas embargoes. But I think you raise a second issue, which is that of accountability and who it is even or which actor it is that is exerting the kind of pressure that leads to the result in question. One of the things you see in the corporate context is not only governments sitting on corporations and trying to have them change their behavior, either sitting on multinational corporations or sitting on national corporations that are violating the rights of their workers because of bilateral pressure, international pressure on them. But you see non-governmental actors bypassing the state altogether. So having led my presentation by saying the state remains first and foremost the enforcer of rights, you actually see NGOs launching their own kind of private campaigns and going around corporations and trying actually to get consumers to sanction companies. And then that raises all kinds of questions as to where the NGOs are themselves developing their metrics and who is keeping track of the NGO itself and what its political agenda is. So I think the empirical question, I mean, I don't actually know the answer as to how effective the ban on tear gas has been, but I mean, that's the kind of research we hope the car sector is going to commence. But I also think that there's a sort of pluralization both of the target of human rights advocates. It's not just governments anymore, it's not just states anymore, it's also companies, it's also sort of paramilitaries and private armed forces. So issues of enforceability are sort of getting diffused, on multi-dimensions, and I think it can be very problematic in terms of actually developing the very metrics that we demand.
On the second floor?
Hi, I'm Madeline Lohman from Harvard College, and I just had a question about states where it's not a crisis human rights situation, where it's not something like a genocide, where it's chronic state-mandated human rights abuses, what other states could do to try to prevent that. Obviously, a long-term embargo would eventually end up hurting the very people it was trying to protect, as well as profiting people who did not deserve it. But at the same time, what other avenues are there for states to approach to try to enforce human rights in areas where governments are not cooperating?
Well, I know that the Center for International Development has been very active in urging debt relief and in trying to secure the maintenance of foreign aid. I mean, one of the problems that we have, I was describing a sort of extreme case, as you point out, of how we respond to genocide in the moment. But one of the very dispiriting signs is how isolationist Western governments are becoming ahead of crimes that rise to this level. And you see drastic cutbacks in foreign aid and investment in remedying the very chronic ills that give rise, when triggered, to crimes at the level that I was describing. So I think we have to sort of combat the isolationist trends and not wait till times of crisis. Again, I think that's what the Center for International Development has been trying to do in this country, but I'm not sure even in Western Europe whether the trends are comparable. Michael?
I just had a brief comment on that, and it may not be the example you had in mind, but one of the dilemmas about intervention was incredibly well encapsulated by a remark by a Serbian general to Javier Solana, senior European official, who said, when asked to categorize Serbian policy in Kosovo, said, "A village a day keeps NATO away." That is to say, if you keep repression at a village a day, you can slip beneath the wire. And if you are just incredibly stupid, you do 5 villages a day, and then you have problems. And I think one of the intervention dilemmas for the international community is that the real rogues out there, Milosevic was an unquestioned rogue, Saddam Hussein was an unquestioned rogue, is an unquestioned rogue, is that they've begun to understand the regimes of human rights oversight and are becoming much more adept than they ever were before in calibrating repression below levels of, not necessarily levels of visibility, but levels at which intervention becomes mandatory. And this is a dilemma. I don't have an easy solution to it because I'm against human rights imperialism. I'm against precipitous interventions. My position would be that you've got to raise the barrier very high before you have military intervention particularly. All I can say in answer to the question clearly is we need to develop a way in which it's easier for countries to internationalize human rights problems so that they can get help, so they get monitors, so they get advice. Needless to say, that's a council that only works for those states willing to do it. But if you my point is, if you set the barrier very high, as I would, then you have the problem that I think you're trying to describe. And I think it's a very important problem, which this Serbian general understood perfectly.
Arkan? Yeah, Arkan Fung from the Kennedy School. I'm fascinated by this idea of deliberative equality, and especially as it regards people in the North and the South. And to make the question really crude, this is for Samantha Power and Michael Ignatieff, who I think have different positions on this, or it sounds like. The question is, do you think that the principle of deliberative equality plus a deep concern for human rights implies that we should, we as northern states, and particularly the United States, should intervene more or be more restrained about intervening? And I'm thinking in particular about human rights like freedom of association, where developing countries are very hesitant to incorporate that into trade agreements or any kind of enforceability because they feel like there's not a deliberative relationship between people in the South and people in the North.
Well, my read on deliberative equality is actually that it affirms my kind of put cruelty first ethic, put genocide first ethic. And that is, part of my point was in fact that there is no deliberation in this country that would enable or that would create a political climate that would enable the kind of intervention that is warranted in the face of extreme violations of human rights. And I think part of what goes on in government is there's an assumption about what the American people will tolerate and what the polity can stomach and the risks that they will endure. And here's the real radical utopianist. I believe they're wrong. I actually think that the norm against genocide and for genocide prevention is quite forceful in this country, enhanced, of course, by the proliferation of Holocaust museums and Holocaust education and commemoration. And what I think happens is that there is no deliberation. There is no forum for State Department officials to reach out and to go out to Idaho and Middle America and talk to mayors and local people about what the U.S. stands for. But I actually think that Michael and I are in agreement that the sort of the elitist approach to human rights policy is inappropriate, and that in fact, if you could bring the American people into the discussion, you'd actually end up going in the direction that I would favor.
Can I just add one quick?
Yes, very briefly.
I think it's important to underscore the need for multilateralism in the way that we react to these tensions. One cannot be talking about the North America descending and intervening in support, when this or that happens there. We must have a multilateral framework that makes this possible. In Liberia, the regional body, the regional countries themselves, organize themselves and intervene. I agree, you raise the threshold, yes, so that military intervention is triggered when the incidence of the violation reaches a certain level. But it is important to have a multilateral framework, because otherwise you leave this business to, the whims of bilateralism with all that that means.
Yes.
Me.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Amy. I'm a GSAS student at the Department of Social Medicine as well. I've been in South Africa for a year, looking at how people who work in child-centered fields understand Section 28 in South Africa's Constitution, which is its children's rights section. And what I'm curious about is the way that rights are framed in terms of individual rights in the U.S. How have experiences looking at rights enforcement and thinking in third world contexts help us here to evolve our thinking about rights so that they include rights and relationships, and that they're not conceptualized in such individualistic terms? So if Michael Ignatieff and Kwesi Batwe and
Juan Mendez.
no, I mean thank you, but I'm trying to. I'm so sorry. No, I can't read the speaker from the World Bank would respond to this. I'm so sorry.
You haven't spoken.
Yes, so we should start with Deborah.
This is what I meant when I'm among us lawyers. The short answer for this is in that part of, let's take South Africa, the country you mentioned, there are a number of things that are into play. One, there could be legislations and there could be rights, whether it's international or local, but the interpretation of it vis-a-vis the population is very different. In most cases, people don't even know that those rights exist. That's one of the problems. The government also might not be willing or might not like the population to know that these things exist. So that's one way of looking at it. The rights of children has been declared ages ago, and you would find countries who don't know about it or whose population don't have any access to it. So these are some of the nuances when we look into human rights issues, especially in public health in the north and the south. The rights of the individual in those countries vis-a-vis the rights of the individuals in other countries and the laws and declarations that exist need much more attention. And people, the common people in the south don't have the legacy or the time or the knowledge to access this. So people end up in difficult situations until somebody else from somewhere blows the whistle.
I hesitate, except to say that I have a strong bias towards construing rights in highly individualistic language, because the people we want to protect are individuals, and we don't want to have rights language that mandates the tyranny of communities over individuals. Having said that, and let me give you an example. What's very touching about that South African judgment is that it's about Mrs. Grootboom. It's about an individual with a claim on behalf of a whole bunch of other people. What's moving about it is simply saying, the South African court, among other things, is saying, you don't bulldoze people, you don't bulldoze individuals. Every individual in that society matters. That's what equality, that's what I'm talking about, a discipline. You may not like it, but that's what the Constitution says. These people should not be bulldozed and treated like things. Well, and that's why, unless you have highly individualized rights regimes, you can't validate individuals the way they need to be, and they need individual validation, especially in poor societies, because poor people are treated like things more often than rich people. And so that's one thing. Clearly, any rights regime that's going to have any legitimacy in a country has to be grounded in the culture of the country and interpreted with sensitivity to the culture of the country. And it's not for me to interpret, it's for the South African courts to do so. And it's clear that families are not, universals. We're not all 2.4 suburban American families. There has to be, the construal of children's rights in South Africa should be deeply contextual to South African society. But children's rights only mean something if they can protect individual children from battery, abuse, neglect, and cruelty. Each individual child, not children as a generic, but each one in every family. That's why rights have an individual mode of address. It's not some capitalist, bourgeois thing. I mean, what I'm attached to, it may have been in origin, but what I'm attached to is precisely the individualism of it.
We were originally scheduled to go to 7:15. We were given a dispensation to 7:25. If we go beyond the dispensation, I am afraid that our ability to have future such events like this may not exist, and that would be a pity. Thank you very much to the panelists, and thank you all.
Very nice to be on the same panel. Thank you.
But the privilege of mine.
You were going to argue that it was not.
No.
You were too soft.
Yeah.
You were going to argue the other
Samantha.
side. Next time I'm going to argue that we've gone backwards. Okay. It's good.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Too bad they cut it so short. It was a good question. We have 200 people here. And I count anyway. Here's Brian, how are you? He went to Oxford too, but 2 years before. I'm in the wrong file.